Okay, I'm going to take a somewhat different take on the whole issue, concentrate more on the internal situation of Haiti and the contradictions of Aristide himself. Many observers on the left have indeed argued that the forced departure into exile of Aristide was a result of American imperialism and had little to do with his own policy failures and the country's domestic class structure. While there is merit to this argument, it is ultimately, I would argue, flawed. It ignores Haitian agency and exaggerates the omnipotence of US hegemony. There is no doubt that the Bush administration had little sympathy for Aristide. While it reluctantly acknowledged his legitimacy as president of Haiti, it opposed him on ideological grounds and starved his regime of badly needed foreign assistance. Formulated and exercised by two ultra-conservatives, Roger Noriega and Otto Reich, Washington's policy was bent on empowering Aristide's adversaries. The US encouraged and financed the Convergence Democratique and the Group of 184, the two major opposition organizations. Moreover, while Washington may not have directly supported the rise of the armed insurgency, Washington clearly knew that unsavory elements were training in the Dominican Republic and that they were on the verge, indeed, of seeking the overthrow of Aristide. And yet, the Americans did not stop that insurgency and never really alerted Aristide. In fact, the US simply abandoned Aristide even though he agreed to the terms of the CARICOM engineered compromise. That was the compromise put forward at the last moment by the Caribbean countries, a compromise that the opposition itself rejected. Instead of compelling the opposition to accept that compromise, which would have in fact emasculated Aristide's powers and generated a government of national unity, the White House ominously, and I quote, called into question Aristide's fitness to continue to govern and urged him, again I quote, to examine his position carefully, to accept responsibility, and to act in the best interests of the people of Haiti. In short, once the armed insurgency began and chaos engulfed the country, the Bush administration seized the opportunity to force Aristide's exit. Imperial America was not, however, the sole reason for Aristide's fall. In fact, the material basis of Haiti and its accompanying class structure generated powerful systemic constraints on his capacity to govern effectively. The absolute chasm separating the wealthy minority from the abjectly poor majority inevitably fueled social polarization and class hatred. With the coming to power of Aristide and his Lavalas movement in 1990, the marginalized masses, what we call in Creole, Moun en dehors, were finally asserting themselves. They were asserting their moral and cultural presence in a system that had so far denied them any humanity. Fearing the ascendancy of this vast popular movement and viscerally hating everything that Aristide represented, Haiti's dominant classes never ceased to oppose, challenge, and undermine Lavalas's rule. The dominant classes were simply determined to preserve their status, wealth, and privilege. In their eyes, any redistribution of resources in an environment of utter scarcity was simply unacceptable. Thus, based on an extremely weak economic foundation, the island's class structure inhibited the flowering of truly progressive changes. Suffering from the absence of both the productive bourgeoisie and the large working class, Haiti's process of democratization was bound to be hesitant, contradictory, and incomplete. The absence of these two fundamental classes has meant that the country evolved into what I've called a predatory democracy. By predatory democracy, I mean a system of governance based on a criminalized zero-sum game of power, dominated by intense processes of class formation, where factions of the political class fight for supremacy, where elected officials at the highest level are controlled by opaque private forces. If you look at the drug trade, you can understand the realities of those opaque forces and their capacity to run things at different levels, not only in the government, but also in the private sector and obviously in banking. And finally, a predatory democracy is a system in which elections are held regularly and are usually fraudulent. And that has been the story of all elections except the one that led Aristide to power in 1991. So a predatory democracy is that kind of zero-sum game system, but it is not a completely closed system of power. It offers some space for maneuvering. For instance, under Aristide's regime, the opposition and its political parties were not silenced, civil society was not extinguished, and a ferociously anti-Lavalas press remained very vocal. The fact remains, nonetheless, that such a system is rooted in what I have called la politique du ventre, belly politics, which is a form of governability based on the acquisition of personal wealth through the conquest of state offices. When destitution is the norm and private avenues to wealth are rare, politics becomes a form of capital accumulation, virtually the sole means of material and social advancement for those not born into wealth and privilege. Controlling the state turns into a violent fight to monopolize the benefits of political power. The politique du ventre did not spare Lavalas. It partly explains its fall and decay. Confronting the vicissitudes of democratization, the hostility of foreign powers, the ferocious opposition of the dominant classes, the generalized fatigue caused by difficult and permanent political combat, the acute material hardships of their social class, and their aspirations for upward social mobility, the Lavalas cadres fell into the most opportunistic types of behavior. Ultimately, they joined a small circle of what people call in Haiti grands mangeurs, the big eaters, and they abandoned their destitute followers to the harsh realities of survival in a hungry world. Lavalas' predicament was not, however, the exclusive result of structural constraints, imperial manipulations, and ruling class opposition. It was also of its own making. Indeed, Aristide's demise would have been unlikely had it not been for his own policies, decisions, and messianism. He did little to transform the inherited authoritarian tradition. He armed young unemployed thugs, the chimères, to intimidate the opposition. He sought to govern alone as a messiah. If you were in Haiti just before he fell, you could see huge billboards saying, Jesus Christ, Aristide, Haiti. That kind of messianism tells you something about politics as Aristide saw it. While voicing a radical rhetoric, Aristide followed the neoliberal strictures of structural adjustment. In collaboration with the Dominican government, he opened a major free trade zone near the town of Guanamet, in the north of the country. In addition, his regime was incapable of resisting the temptations of corruption, in spite of its promise of what he called then peace of mind and peace in the belly. Things began to fall apart for Lavalas in the aftermath of the coup of '91, and upon Aristide's return to the presidency in '94, when he did little to stop a political campaign that sought to extend his presidential term by the 3 years that he had spent in exile. Although he ultimately consented to step down under international and domestic pressures, he did so reluctantly and thereby alienated significant sectors of the old Lavalas alliance. Aristide's desire to stay in power allowed friends and foes who saw in his behavior a dangerous authoritarian temptation. Resorting to the Haitian authoritarian tradition, Aristide came to resemble the opportunistic politician who has defined much of the country's history. In '95, he created his own party, Famille Lavalas, to control a machine that would execute his will, regroup his followers, prepare his re-election, and incarcerate his chosen successor, René Préval, into his own orbit. Not surprisingly, the circumstances surrounding Préval's ascendancy to the presidency in '95 accentuated the serious divisions plaguing Lavalas. 3 years later, Lavalas' internal conflicts were wide open, and the movement completely ruptured. The progressive political parties, cadres, and intellectuals who had supported Aristide were now deserting him. The Lavalas movement was becoming little else but Aristide himself. The immediate cause of the Lavalas split was the bungled parliamentary elections of April of '97. Poorly organized and with fewer than 10% of the electorate participating, the elections were won by pro-Aristide candidates and condemned as rigged by former Lavalasian parties. The crisis was aggravated further by the bizarre method used to count the vote in the controversial elections of 2000. Ignoring calls from the international community and the Haitian opposition to recount the votes, the Electoral Commission, under powerful pressures from both Préval and Aristide, decided to stick by its illegal procedures and ultimately handed over to Famille Lavalas quasi-absolute political hegemony. That was an unnecessary and silly decision on the part of Préval and Aristide. It was very clear that Lavalas would have won in any case, but Lavalas wanted absolute power. So the lesson from this history, in fact, is that Lavalas sought to monopolize absolute power for the longue durée. As former President René Préval put it, he said in Creole, "Nous prenons pouvoir, nous prenons le net." We have taken power and we will keep it forever. Similarly, Jonas Petit, a major Lavalas leader, declared in December, just before Aristide fell, that his party would be in office for at least 200 years. The ferocious desire to conquer power and keep it is not, however, the exclusive obsession of Lavalas. In fact, it is a recurring theme and phenomenon of Haiti's politics. It reflects a tendency of lower middle-class movements, such as Lavalas, to abandon their radical agenda and use their newly found state power to accumulate resources and gradually integrate into the existing economic elite. Not surprisingly, Aristide lost much of the massive and unconditional support he once enjoyed, and his hold on his chimère, the thugs, the armed thugs, became elusive and fragile. In fact, the chimère began to turn against Aristide himself. The assassination of Amiot Métayer, the leader of the chimère in the town of Gonaïves, of the so-called cannibal army, generated violent anti-Lavalas protests and marked the beginning of the armed insurrection that ultimately forced Aristide into exile. Convinced that it was Aristide himself who ordered Métayer's murder, the cannibal army, led by Métayer's brother, a fellow by the name of Buteur Métayer, swore to wage war against the president until he was overthrown. In the process, Aristide lost the ability to co-opt and play his chimère off against one another. When former soldiers and death squad leaders of the disbanded army joined forces with the cannibals, Aristide's fate was virtually sealed. Facing a declining popularity, an armed insurrection, the unmitigated hostility of the civil opposition, and French and American demands for his resignation, Aristide had no choice but to depart into exile. It was an offer he couldn't refuse. This departure was in fact the tragic political demise of a figure who had once enjoyed immense popular support and embodied the aspirations of the vast majority of Haitians for a just and democratic order. Besieged by the harsh material realities of a devastated economy, his own demons, a reactionary elite, and an increasingly hostile international community, Jean-Bertrand Aristide was incapable of seizing the historic opportunity of creating a mass movement that might have begun to equalize life chances among Haitians. That the armed insurgents, former members of the disbanded and despised military, found little popular resistance in their march to power, symbolized Aristide's ultimate failure. Lavalas's failure should not mask, however, the decisive role played by the opposition in the fall of Aristide. Aristide's foes were clearly responsible for the predicament confronting the country. Indeed, many of those who castigated Lavalas joined forces with death squad leaders and former military thugs to force Aristide into exile. Similarly, they benefited in the past from the very electoral corruption that characterized the 2000 elections won by Aristide and his party. In truth, there is no reason to believe that the irregularities that marred these ballots of 2000, egregious as they were, had a greater impact on the final results than those that marked previous elections, including those of 1995. And yet, the international community and the United States in particular, deemed the 95 ballots free and fair. This decision opened the door to persistent fraud and the perception that what really mattered was the regular rituals of elections rather than popular participation or the rigors of electoral honesty. Thus, both the opposition and the international community lacked credibility. They legitimated electoral processes according to their ever-shifting interest and changing dispositions towards alleged winners and losers. Haiti's ills are the product of the collective failure of the political class and its external allies. In fact, in the eyes of the Aristide opposition, when they were dealing with Aristide, the resolution of the crisis entailed nothing but Aristide's departure from the presidency. A real compromise with Aristide was simply unacceptable. The opposition's posture stemmed from its realization that in spite of all his faults, Aristide was the dominant and most popular figure in Haitian politics. The opposition knew that while its organization, the Democratic Platform, had broadened its base beyond the urban elites represented by Convergence Démocratique and the Group of 184, it did not have the legal means to dislodge Aristide from power. Given that it was a disparate movement of contradictory elements, united only by its visceral hatred of Aristide, the Democratic Platform had little chance of becoming a viable electoral or governmental alliance. In reality, the opposition would have been hard-pressed to defeat Lavalas at the ballot box. Therefore, it had no interest in challenging Aristide in new elections, and thus it rejected the CARICOM proposal. The opposition gambled that this rejection would aggravate economic problems, make the country ungovernable, and undermine further Aristide's legitimacy, and thus clear the way for its eventual seizure of power. As we know, the gamble paid off. Aristide was ultimately compelled to go into exile. His forced departure created the environment for the temporary deployment of a US-led multinational force of more than 3,000 peacekeepers, which is now being replaced by a more permanent United Nations contingent of about 8,000 troops. These forces are supposed to stabilize the country and re-establish the rule of law. Pacifying Haiti, however, requires a comprehensive disarmament of the paramilitary groups. However, the commander of the multinational force, US General Ronald Coleman, flatly stated, "Disarmament is not our mission." Similarly, Brazil's Army General Augusto Heleno Ribeiro Pereira, the commander of the UN peacekeeping forces, expressed extreme caution about his force's capacity to disarm the country. Under such circumstances, Haiti will inevitably continue to hover around the abyss. Moreover, once the peacekeepers exit the country, a new cycle of violence and repression is likely to set in. It has already started, as you pointed out, but it probably will intensify. It is in these extremely precarious conditions that Boniface Alexandre, the former chief of the Supreme Court, was catapulted to an interim and emasculated presidency. In addition, the international community, in consultation with the Council of Eminent Haitians, named Gérard Latortue, a technocrat well connected to the international financial organizations and the United Nations, to a vastly empowered position of Prime Minister. The new Latortue administration claims to be non-partisan, independent, and competent. While there is some plausibility to these claims, it is clear that the interim government has systematically marginalized Lavalas. Not a single member of this party is included in this alleged government of national unity. Thus, Haiti confronts acute problems of political reconciliations, which are compounded by the utter incapacity of both the Latortue government and anti-Lavalas forces to formulate a viable, progressive plan for Haiti's social transformation. Neither Latortue nor Aristide's foes has offered a serious program of poverty alleviation. Without such a program, peace and decency cannot be established. Moreover, the economy has completely collapsed, and an inflationary spiral is ravaging the already miserable standard of living of Haiti's vast majority. The obscene gap separating the small, affluent elite from the destitute masses will thus persist and continue to nurture the authoritarian tradition that has characterized the country's history. At the moment, the constellation of Mangeur, that in itself would be no small achievement. In addition, the La Tortue regime will benefit, at least in the short term, from an infusion of growth will reduce the conditions of absolute misery confronting 80% of the population. In fact, except for pious injunctions of bringing clean water and electricity to the destitute majority, the interim government has no program of poverty alleviation. Thus, the fall of Aristide and the policies of the new regime have empowered conservative reactionary forces and greatly undermined the possibility of national reconciliation. There is a strong likelihood that power will return to the most reactionary elements of society, that the army will be re-established, and that the ugly realities of the past will reappear dressed in new garb. Finally, the staggering disillusionment of vast sections of the population aching out a miserable living in a ruined economy is a clear sign that things could soon fall apart again. Exhausted, Haiti is in a time of disarray. In its bicentennial year, the country is again occupied and confronting a systemic crisis. In this context, the best that one can hope in the short term is that new elections from the brink of a civil war, the more liberal, reformist sectors of the Haitian political class may finally realize that they should accept the logic of democracy. They may come to respect the verdict of the ballot box and understand that they can no longer tolerate the appalling inequalities between the destitute majority and the affluent minority. Those sectors may finally recognize that a better future for themselves requires the demise of the old habits and the adoption of a more inclusive social pact. The history of the country, however, warns us that material constraints and entrenched class interests weigh very heavily against this happy denouement. As the saying goes, the struggle continues. Thank you.
We got started a little bit late, so I'm just going to get right into taking some hands and questions and comments. I want to encourage people to get comments or questions out early in the discussion, and I'll if you raise your hand, I'll write it down.
I want to ask, Roger brought up the point that Aristide actually brought up his own demise. It was brought, the point Roger brought up that Aristide brought up his own demise, basically by conforming to U.S. standards. I want to know, do you think Aristide actually could have made an actual change in the way Haiti was run? And so do you think Lavalas as a group itself could have caused change in the way Haiti was run as basically as a sweatshop country? Do you think it actually could have made change rather than just conform? That's basically my question. And also, a question for actually. As far as the history of Haiti is concerned, and Latin America is concerned, can you talk more about the history of the U.S. and Latin America as a whole? You know, as far as going back to the Monroe Doctrine, when the United States was first interested in Latin America in the first place. You know, why was that? Why did it decide this area of interest we need to be a part of? And after he became independent, I know this is my third question. After Haiti's first, before Haiti's first occupation by the U.S., what was the state of Haiti? And what was it like before the U.S. actually went in there for the first time in 1905?
Okay, I might want to take another couple comments before you guys come back. That's all right? Isn't that great?
I guess kind of following on your first question, the picture painted was very grim, and it seems to me that that's certainly true. It is very grim. But that first Democratic election in '91, when Aristide was elected, seems to me that we shouldn't underestimate what an important thing that was in the Caribbean in that time, and in Haiti's history. I mean, they have such, I went to the talk this morning actually on the long time ago history of Haiti and the overthrowing of slavery and all of that, which was another amazing, I mean, the whole history of the country seems really amazing, but that they could come out of what happened after that and have a successful democratic election in the context of a very grim Caribbean picture overall, and coming out of the Reagan years and all of that, and the hope that, I mean, I don't know, but I'm guessing that, you know, the strong movement that led to Aristide's election and the successful democratic election, the two of those together really set an example for the Caribbean and Latin America in general and gave some hope coming out of a bad situation. And that paradoxically, that was very related to Aristide's demise, and his point, how did, you know, Aristide could have, you know, led to his own demise and his actions and all of that. I think that's very true, but why was he so targeted by the US and by Europe? I mean, it's not coincidental. Like, he was a real left-wing, I mean, he was a liberation theologian. He was derobed by the Catholic Church, and he was really, I mean, symbolically to the people and to the movement, an important figure. And I think you can't underestimate the impact that that had on how he was treated, and, you know, how much attention the whole international community and, you know, the World Bank denied Haiti a loan. You know, you talk about structural readjustment, they were actually denied a World Bank loan. You know, weren't even given the chance to get in, I mean, of course they are in debt, but just that they were treated so badly. And I think you can blame Aristide, but it's also like the context that he came up in, so.
Okay, why don't I take another comment before, and then have you guys come back? Okay, you guys okay? Okay.
How important do you guys think race was and is in terms of United States, the U.S. foreign policy in relation to Haiti, and the fact that it is the only country that has a person of African descent to run the country, and how U.S. responds to that, and how much of a role do you think that plays? How important do you think race is in terms of U.S. foreign policy in relation to Haiti?
I have Lee.
I mean, race was at the core of it. You had the first slave revolution. You had a slave economy at the foundation of the construction of the United States. It was an enemy, it had to be strangled. It's been in the, before the U.S. even was a fully developed imperialist country, Haiti had to be made an example of boycott. It was only in the context, when was it recognized? In the context of the most left-wing the U.S. ever got, officially, formally, in the middle of the Civil War. That's what it took, because the example of a successful slave revolution was a moral threat to the slaveocracy and where slavery had